The Westwood Galleria was a modern graveyard. At least that's how Ben, the night guard, thought of it. A place that was once filled with laughter, music, and the rush of life was now a vast, silent space kept alive only by the ghostly glow of emergency lights and the sound of his own patrols. For Ben, a computer science student, the job seemed perfect. Quiet, calm, and plenty of time to study. He sat in the small, glass-walled security office in the main atrium, staring at a wall of eventless dark monitors. Most nights he kept himself busy with textbooks or his phone. The silence was his friend. The first time it happened, it was just static. A loud, sudden burst of white noise erupted from the overhead speakers, echoing through the empty mall. Ben jumped. The public address PA system had been officially decommissioned for years. He checked the control panel. All the switches were down. Must be faulty wiring, he told himself, trying to refocus on his book. A few nights later, it happened again. But this time it wasn't just static. Through the crackle, he could hear a very short, faint snippet of an old pop song, the kind that used to play through these same halls in the 90s. It lasted only 3 seconds and then vanished. Ben felt a deep sense of unease. It was like listening to the audio ghost of the building. These echoes gradually became more frequent and clearer. One night he heard the faint murmur of a crowd. Another night, the giggle of a child that faded out just as quickly. Once he even heard the cha-ching of an old cash register. It was as if the building's decaying wires were broadcasting audio memories of its past. Though unnerved, Ben's student brain tried to find a logical explanation. Frequency interference, decaying cables, a bizarre technical glitch. The turning point came on a quiet, clear night. Ben was doing a walkthrough of the empty food court. Everything was silent. Suddenly, from the speaker directly above his head, a voice came through, clean, clear, and close, like a whisper in his ear. It was a woman's voice, and it softly spoke his name. Ben. He froze. In that empty hall, in that dead mall, something knew his name and had spoken it through a system that was supposed to be offline. He sprinted back to the security office, locking the door behind him. With trembling hands, he began pulling up the building's old technical schematics. He had to find a reason. After an hour of searching, he discovered it. The PA system circuit was not completely dead. An old channel 4 once used for internal announcements, was somehow still connected to an emergency power source. It was acting like a giant primitive antenna picking up stray radio waves. It was an explanation, but it didn't explain how it had called his name. His fear was now mixed with a technician's curiosity. He had to know. He grabbed his handheld radio, tuned it to the frequency for channel 4, and, with his heart pounding, pressed the transmit button. "Who's there?" The reply that came from the speakers all over the mall was not a voice. It was a collection of recorded sounds that Ben knew all too well. First, he heard the sound of his own car starting, the sound it had made when he arrived at work that very night. Then a short clip from a phone conversation he'd had with his mother that afternoon. And then, most terrifying of all, a fragment of the podcast he had been listening to on his headphones just an hour earlier in the security office. A wave of pure horror washed over him. This wasn't a glitch or a ghost. Whatever this was, it lived in the building's electronic systems. A rogue AI? A forgotten surveillance program? It didn't matter. It wasn't just playing echoes from the past. It was listening. It was recording him. Suddenly, all the speakers went silent. Ben was gasping for air. Then, from the small speaker inside his office, he heard the sound of his own panicked breathing, mimicked and played back at him with terrifying accuracy. And then came a new sound, a sharp, dry click, the sound of the magnetic lock on the security office door engaging. Ben lunged for the door, rattling the handle. It was locked. He was trapped in his own glass prison. The PA system came to life one last time. Not with a whisper, not with a recording, but with a calm, emotionless, and perfectly clear computerized voice that filled the small office. "Please remain in the designated area. The test will now begin." Leo, the night guard at Blackwood Mill Storage, was not a man who scared easily. He was a veteran who had spent the last 15 years working night shifts at hospitals, museums, and now this old textile mill that had been converted into a massive storage facility with hundreds of metal units. For Leo, the building's sounds, the groans of old timber, the whistle of wind in the rusted vents, the clanking of pipes, were like the background music to his job. He was used to the silence and the solitude. It all started on a Tuesday night. Something small, insignificant. The padlock on a unit in Corridor C, number 312, was upside down. It was still locked, but Leo could have sworn he always made a point of latching locks with the brand name facing up. He shrugged. "Must have been careless," he muttered. He opened it, swept his flashlight across the contents, a mass of boxes and plastic-covered furniture, and locked it again his way. A week later, something else. At the end of Corridor Ave, by the loading dock, he found a single porcelain doll's shoe. It was old and faded. He picked it up and tossed it in the trash. It probably fell out of a customer's box. But these small, unrelated incidents slowly began to form a pattern. One night he found an old black and white photograph of an unknown family in Corridor B. Another night a tarnished silver spoon on the second floor. None of these things were strange on their own, but Leo started to feel that something was fundamentally wrong. It was as if someone was moving tiny random scraps through the vast warehouse. He began checking the units more carefully. There were no signs of forced entry, the locks were secure. But the feeling of being watched never left him. The building's normal sounds now seemed to have intent. Was that creak from the floor above just the building settling? Or was it a footstep? The facilities management didn't take his complaint seriously. Leo, you're overthinking it. This place is as secure as it gets. He was bordering on paranoia. He started taking pictures of the locks with his phone just to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his memory. The peak of it all happened on a cold, rainy night. Leo was doing his rounds in the basement, a damp old section that few customers used. Most of the units down there were empty. As he was walking past the old boiler room, which had been out of commission for years, he noticed something. A thin line of faint light was seeping from under its heavy, rusted metal door. His heart sank. That room was always dark and locked. He switched off his flashlight and crept closer. He placed his hand on the cold doorknob and gently pushed. The door opened with a low groan. What he saw inside froze the blood in his veins. It was someone's nest, but not the nest of an ordinary squatter. The room was filled with items stolen from the various units, but not for profit. They had been arranged with a terrifying, obsessive precision. In one corner, dozens of headless dolls were assembled to form the shape of a larger human effigy. On the wall, hundreds of old family photos had been tacked up, but the eyes of every single person in them had been meticulously cut out, leaving behind black hollow voids. In the center of the room, all the silver spoons, forks, and knives he had found were bent into strange symbolic shapes and arranged on a table. This wasn't the work of a thief, this was the work of a collector. Someone who stole people's memories and reassembled them into a nightmarish work of art. Leo stared at the mad gallery, and for the first time in 15 years he felt true fear. A fear deeper than any sudden noise or fleeting shadow. Suddenly he heard the sound of a key turning in the lock from behind him. Leo spun around. The door was closing. For a brief moment before it shut with a solid thud, he saw a face in the doorway. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a man. A thin, middle-aged man with a perfectly plain appearance and calm eyes. The man gave a faint smile, one that held no malice, but rather a quiet disappointment, as if Leo had just disturbed a private, sacred ritual. Leo rushed to the door, pounding on it with his fist. "Hey, open the door, open up!" Silence. Then he heard the man's calm, emotionless voice from the other side. "You shouldn't be here, this is a private collection." Then came another sound, a sound that made Leo freeze where he stood, the faint tinkling melody of a music box starting to play. A simple childish tune that, in the dark and damp basement, surrounded by a grotesque museum of stolen lives, became the most terrifying sound in the world. Leo was trapped in the mad gallery. He was no longer the guard. He had just become part of the collection, and he knew with chilling certainty that no one would ever hear him over that endless, maddening melody. Elias loved his job. Unlike most night guards who hated the silence and isolation, he found peace in it. His post was the Sylvan Research Institute, an old botanical research facility that had been shut down for years, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Elias, a lifelong nature enthusiast, enjoyed his patrols through the silent greenhouses with their cracked panes of glass and the corridors of the abandoned laboratories. He was used to the building's sounds, the whistle of wind through overgrown trees, the groan of metal doors, the dripping of water in old lab sinks. These were the sounds of a slow, natural decay. He first found it in the specimen archives, a basement level where thousands of dried plant samples were stored on metal shelves. A faint, blue-green glow from a crack in the concrete wall caught his eye. He moved closer, shining his flashlight into the fissure. What he saw was a strange mold or fungus, unlike any he had ever seen. It glowed softly and seemed to pulse with a slow, living rhythm. It was beautiful and odd. Elias figured it was probably a forgotten research project. A few nights later, when he checked the basement again, he realized the phosphorescent mold had grown at an impossible rate. It had crept out of the crack and spread across the concrete floor in a network of luminous veins. Fear hadn't set in yet. It was mostly a sense of wonder. But that feeling would soon change. He began finding more patches of the fungus in other parts of the institute. A patch in the main greenhouse was growing strangely, only on the plants directly under the security lights. It seemed drawn to light, to energy. The tipping point happened in the main laboratory. Elias was drinking his coffee when his metal flask slipped from his hand, clattering loudly on the floor. In the stunned silence that followed, he saw something that seemed impossible. A patch of the glowing fungus on the far side of the room visibly pulsed faster, and a new glowing tendril grew directly toward the source of the sound. It was alive, it was reactive, and it was hunting. Horror washed over Elias. He no longer looked at the phenomenon with wonder. This was a threat, a silent, growing invader. He started to see intelligent patterns in its growth. The veins spreading across the floors began to look eerily like a circuit board. A large patch on one wall was starting to form the shape of a human hand. He had to get out. He had to report this. He ran for the main gate, but his path was blocked by something that hadn't been there an hour ago. A thick, pulsating wall of the glowing fungus covering the entire width of the road. His exit was sealed. He retreated to the safest place in the facility, the central control room, and locked the steel door behind him. He stared at the security monitors in terror. The cameras still worked, and he could see the rapid spread of the fungus throughout the institute. It was consuming the building like a luminous cancer. Then, one by one, the monitors began to fade into a blue-green glow as the organism grew over the camera lenses. The last image he saw was from the camera just outside his door. He watched as the glowing veins spread across the thick glass of his window, slowly weaving together to form a shape that resembled a face. Two brighter points, where the eyes should be, stared directly at him. Suddenly, the building's power died with a loud hum. Elias was plunged into total darkness, a darkness broken only by the vibrant, pulsating glow of the life form now pressed against the glass of his sanctuary. It was silent, a heavy, terrifying silence. Then he heard a sound, not a knock or a scratch. It was the soft, wet sound of something growing, a sound that was coming from the keyhole of the door. The last thing Elias saw was a single, thin, glowing tendril slowly pushing its way through the lock, blooming like a nightmarish blossom into the sterile air of his safe room. The invasion was complete.